Violent scenes in Melbourne of construction workers protesting outside the industry's union headquarters for a second consecutive day shouldn't come as a surprise to the authorities in Victoria. The government has known for some time that a key measure in its roadmap to reopen the state and begin living with COVID-19 is a major sticking point for workers in a number of sectors. Now, with the $22 billion construction industry shut down for 2 weeks and an even longer closure being discussed, a tense new battle is brewing. Neither side is likely to back down easily. With a workforce known for its at times militant industrial action declaring war on Daniel Andrews and his government. And it's a brawl that could drag in other industries and their powerful trade union bodies right around Australia. Anger and chaos erupt. Hundreds of tradies walked off the job in Melbourne on Monday and descended on the Elizabeth Street office of the Construction, Forestry, Maritime, Mining and Energy Union CFMEU. Violence and chaos soon erupted, with bottles and other projectiles thrown and even a dog allegedly kicked, with police responding by firing rubber bullets into the crowd. In response, the government has shut down the construction industry for a period of 2 weeks in Melbourne, Geelong, Ballarat, Mitchell Shire and the Surf Coast, effective midnight on Monday. We've been clear if you don't follow the rules, we won't hesitate to take action, Victorian Treasurer and Industrial Relations Minister Tim Pallas said last night. We have seen widespread non-compliance across the industry and that's why we're taking necessary steps to protect every single Victorian. A large number of protesters gathered again in the CBD on Tuesday, met by an enormous police force, including riot and tactical response officers. Anger has been brewing for some time over COVID-19 safety measures imposed on the sector, which is already subject to a 25% cap on its workforce, but the straw that broke the camel's back was an abruptly announced vaccine mandate. In order to work on site, all tradies in Victoria must have received at least their first jab by September 23, the state's COVID reopening roadmap declared. But the mandate was an unrealistic and blunt approach that undermines the vaccine rollout. Given at extremely short notice, and which did little else but inflame tensions, the Victorian Building Industry Group of Unions BIGU said in a statement. The BIGU maintains the view that the construction industry would have voluntarily reached high levels of vaccination without a heavy-handed approach. The statement read, "This heavy-handed mandate by the Chief Health Officer, which was implemented with no notice, has only served to drive many people towards the anti-vaxxer movement." The union's Victorian State Secretary John Setka said there had been little consultation with the government over COVID measures affecting the industry. "I have never spoken to Daniel Andrews, to be honest," Mr. Setka told the Today program on Tuesday. "I have never met him and never spoken to him. I've had no discussions with Daniel Andrews ever." Tradies unlikely alone in views. Those watching the chaos outside the CFMEU office on Monday play out on the news and across social media were horrified, but experts say the angry boilover is unsurprising. University of Melbourne law professor Ju Chong Tham said the Australian Council of Trade Unions ACTU fundamentally opposes vaccine mandates. Some individual unions are in favour of requiring jabs among their workforces, teachers for example, but Professor Tham said the broader union movement has been remarkably cohesive in opposing employer mandates. 4 interlocking principles underpin this position, he wrote in an article for The Conversation. They are that high vaccination rates should be attained through encouragement and facilitation. Not employer mandates, but where strictly necessary, mandates should be implemented through public health orders, that effective access to vaccines should be secured, and that the voices of workers should be respected. On that basis, this week's mayhem shouldn't come as a shock to authorities, especially when it comes to a union renowned for its staunch opposition to any infringement on workers' rights. Tradies unlikely alone in views. Those watching the chaos outside the CFMEU office on Monday play out on the news and across social media were horrified, but experts say the angry boilover is unsurprising. University of Melbourne law professor Ju Chong Tham said the Australian Council of Trade Unions ACTU fundamentally opposes vaccine mandates. Some individual unions are in favour of requiring jabs among their workforces, teachers for example, but Professor Tham said the broader union movement has been remarkably cohesive in opposing employer mandates. 4 interlocking principles underpin this position, he wrote in an article for The Conversation. They are that high vaccination rates should be attained through encouragement and facilitation. Not employer mandates, but where strictly necessary, mandates should be implemented through public health orders, that effective access to vaccines should be secured, and that the voices of workers should be respected. On that basis, This week's mayhem shouldn't come as a shock to authorities, especially when it comes to a union renowned for its staunch opposition to any infringement on workers' rights. Bizarre fake tradies claim. Mr. Setka has spent much of the past day furiously condemning the violence in a string of media appearances and has sought to distance his members from the protest. On the Today Show on Tuesday, Mr. Setka insisted the crowd was filled with fake tradies who are actually neo-Nazis trying to hijack the movement to stir up trouble. There were anti-vaxxer activists there who are not union members or from our industry. They're the ones you see at all the protests, Mr. Setka said. Then they were consuming a whole heap of alcohol. Thanks to these morons, 300,000 Victorian tradies are sitting at home for at least the next couple of weeks. But it could drag out longer. While there were no doubt tradies among the mob, Mr. Setka insisted most of those gathered were troublemakers who don't work in the industry. There was a sprinkling of construction workers there of our members and the rest were just people. I wouldn't even know who they are, he said. It's a similar claim made by Actor Secretary Sally McManus, who told the ABC the protest was organised by forces outside the construction industry. We know from social media networks that the same people who were at the rallies on the weekend were asking people to come to these ones and to dress up in high-vis, Ms. McManus said. An ugly protest erupted in Melbourne on Saturday featuring largely anti-vaccination and anti-lockdown, with some in the crowd wearing Nazi symbols. The mob turned on police and several were hospitalised with multiple injuries including broken bones. While it's been argued the protest crowds outside the CFMEU are not representative of tradies' views, a snap audit last week of COVID measure compliance across 200 construction sites in Melbourne found more than 70% were ignoring restrictions. Government's approach bungled. In some situations, the ACTU and BCA acknowledge that vaccines should be mandated, that is in high-risk workplace settings. But they say those decisions should be made when absolutely necessary and through nationally consistent public health orders based on expert advice. Those two words, nationally consistent, are important in the context of the past 2 days' trader chaos. The union has previously described decisions by the Andrews government surrounding COVID measures as being made without proper consultation and poorly communicated. Last week's forced closure of tea rooms, or designated break spaces on construction sites, out of fear of them being high-risk infection settings, sparked fresh anger in the industry. Traders walked off the job in sporadic strikes, not organised by the CFMEU but nonetheless highly visible, setting up tables and chairs and taking their coffee breaks in the middle of streets. The industry has been subjected to closure orders through several separate extended lockdowns now and was operating at a 25% worker capacity. The sudden imposition of a vaccination deadline for tradies was the final straw. At stake is the fundamental principle of worker voice, Professor Tham said of COVID measures. Worker voice is also central to workplace health and safety legislation, which requires consultation with workers and trade unions on employer vaccination policies. The underlying insight is that worker education and empowerment are key to workplace safety. The ACTU and a number of individual unions have called for workers to be consulted on vaccine mandates. We see in the union's opposition to employer-mandated vaccinations a framework of principles that places public health as its centre, together with respect for bodily autonomy, workers' rights, fairness and democracy. This approach may prove to be more far-sighted than employer mandates.